Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Judge Andrew P. Napolitano.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, my friends. Lovely, lovely introduction. We're almost like a traveling pair. We did this a few hours ago on the other side of Florida, or it seems like it's the other side of Florida. I think I was on the Superior Court bench for about a week when they assigned me to small claims. So you walk out into a courtroom with about this many people in it at 8:30 in the morning. They all want their cases heard because after lunch you'll have a crowd of the same size. An example of a case is the dry cleaner ruined my dress, but he also tried to pick up my sister. So a lawyer in the room says to me, Your Honor, I'm going to need a translator because my client doesn't speak English. What language does your client speak? Italian. So I called the courthouse administrator. The Italian translator was busy in another courtroom. I said, is there anybody in the courtroom that can speak Italian? Little guy in the back raises his hand. He comes up. We swear in this guy to translate. Here's exactly literally what happened. Lawyer to translator, give the court your name. Translator to witness, what is it you name? I thought, let me see where this is going to go. Counsel, ask your next question. Lawyer to translator, give the court your address. Translator to witness, where is it you house? I look at this guy. I thought you told me you could speak Italian. He says, I can, Your Honor, but my English, she's not too good. One time I was picking a jury in New Jersey and in many states, the judge picks the jury in a jury trial, criminal case. Again, you have this many people in a courtroom, actually more than this, and you have to find 12 people who have no bias, no prejudice, no knowledge of the facts, no knowledge of the people, no interest in the outcome, in order to try the case. This is a drug distribution case. The state troopers caught a guy coming off the George Washington Bridge with a truckload of cocaine. So, you know, it's a serious issue. I had a feeling that some people in this room didn't want to be on the jury. So I said, anybody that doesn't want to be on this jury, raise your hand. Little lady in the back raised her hand. I said, yes, what is it, madam? She said, I can't be on this jury because of my occupation. I thought, what could she possibly do? I said, what do you do, madam? She said, I'm a soothsayer. I thought to myself, since 1995, who calls themselves a soothsayer? So I fell for this. I said, all right, madam, how does that prevent you from being on the jury? She said, Judge, I already know how the case ends up. I should have said, all right, lady, tell us now and save us the next 3 weeks in the courtroom. I have not hesitated in my work at Fox to criticize Republicans as well as Democrats when, in my view, they are using the government to go outside the confines of the Constitution. Sometimes I get myself in a little bit of trouble at Fox for doing that. But I am, in some small way, responsible for the administration of George W. Bush. Now, I'm going to bring you back to a period which, if you lived in Florida, you, I'm sure, have not forgotten. And that's November and December of 2000, the recount. As Fox's senior legal on-air person, I have to become an expert in something I never thought I'd have to know about, Florida election law. So I have to understand hanging chads and dimple chads and what a recount is and when it's triggered and who does the recount and how it can be challenged in a way to explain that to everybody. We are now in late November, early December, and I'm on air one night with my colleague Britt Hume. He's in D.C., I'm in New York. Through the magic of television, it looks like we're next to each other. So Britt and I are talking about some constitutional principle when all of a sudden Fox does one of those things that it does every about 15 or 20 times every 30 minutes. Swoosh, Fox alert. And the alert tells the on-air person to start reading from the teleprompter. It's some news we have to get out immediately. Heaven forbid CNN should get it out before we do. So obviously Britt starts reading the teleprompter. And the teleprompter says the following. The Florida Supreme Court has just ordered that the recount should resume not only in the 4 counties where Governor Bush has challenged Vice President Gore, but in all 72 counties of the state of Florida. And Governor Bush's people have announced that they're going to appeal this decision to the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit in Atlanta. He stops reading at that point. He turns to me. He said, what do you think about that? And I said, well, it's pretty basic. The Circuit Court of Appeals does not have jurisdiction to hear an appeal from a state Supreme Court. He said, what should they do? looked at my watch. It said, it's 5 minutes to 7 at night. The Supreme Court is closed. They should go to the home of Justice Anthony Kennedy, who lives in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. He's the circuit justice, meaning for the 11th Circuit, meaning he hears emergency appeals from the southeast part of the United States when the appeal is from a state court of last resort. They should knock on the door of Justice Kennedy's home and present him with a petition to stay, that is, stop the effect of the Florida Supreme Court decision, and then the next morning he can poll the other 8 justices. At that point, Brit Hume's show was over. I went upstairs to my office to take a nap. We were going about 20 hours a day in those days, and at 10 o'clock I had to be on with O'Reilly, and of course one can use all the rest one can get for an experience like that. So while I'm in my office, sound asleep, the following occurs. My ever-charming, ever-garrulous, never one to miss a beat colleague Shepard Smith is on, and he's talking about the recount when all of a sudden, swoosh, another Fox alert, and he starts reading from the teleprompter, and the teleprompter says this: Governor Bush's lawyers have just been cited in their cars in Georgetown looking for the personal residence of Justice Anthony Kennedy. And then he stops reading from the script, from the print, the script reader, and he says, do you know what that means? That means that George W. Bush is watching Fox. And he's getting his advice from Judge Napolitano. And the rest, for better or for worse, is history. All right, from ridiculous events to very serious ones. Some men say the earth is round and some men say it is flat. But if it is round, could the king's command flatten it? And if it is flat, could an act of parliament make it round? These words were articulated by Thomas More, who was the former Lord Chancellor of England. He was a lawyer. He was defending himself in his own trial for treason. You may remember the movie A Man for All Seasons. The charge, and under the then law in England proven act of treason, was the refusal to acknowledge that the king was the head of the church on earth. More lost the case, and he lost his head. Of course, his argument to the jury was not only appealing to their common sense. Of course the king couldn't make a flat earth round, and of course Parliament couldn't make a round earth flat. He was also appealing to their understanding of the natural law, of the order of things, of the way the Creator created the universe and the earth and the people who live on it. He was familiar with this natural law argument because he had studied it as a student and utilized it as a judge. He knew that it had been articulated by Aristotle and Augustine and Aquinas. It, of course, would later be picked up by John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. It would cause Jefferson to write in the Declaration of Independence words that we all know. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When Jefferson wrote that, and the signers of it pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honors to it, and then they prepared to fight a war against the mightiest king and the strongest navy and the greatest army on earth at the time, they were wedding the idea of the natural law to America at its birth. And that idea is simply that our rights come from the Creator of humanity and not from the government. Now, the government, of course, at the time was a very oppressive government. It was the king and the parliament 3,000 miles away. One of their acts of oppression was an effort to raise money, ostensibly to raise money. It was called the Stamp Act. This applied to colonists, but not to people in England. It only applied to the colonists in North America. And it required, think about it if you had to do this today, that every colonist have on every piece of paper in his or her home, every newspaper, every book, every financial document, every legal document, every pamphlet, even a poster to be nailed to a tree, a stamp bearing the king's image. Question: how did the king and the parliament know 3,000 miles away if the colonists were following the Stamp Act? Answer: an abominable piece of legislation called the Writs of Assistance Act. This permitted British soldiers to write their own search warrants. So it was not uncommon for a colonist to hear a knock at the door, and a very polite British soldier would hand the colonist a piece of paper on which he had authorized himself and his men to cross the threshold. Something even the King of England couldn't do in England without a search warrant, but authorizing himself and his men to cross the threshold against the will of the homeowner, ostensibly to look for the stamps. Of course, while there, they might help themselves to alcohol if the homeowner couldn't prove that the alcohol which was imported had the duty tax paid on it. They might help themselves to furniture if the furniture looked like it was made elsewhere than the place where it was located, and the owner of the house couldn't prove that he had paid a tax on the furniture. They might even help themselves to the house by not leaving, which is why we have the Third Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits the quartering of troops in private residences against the wishes of the owner. This was, of course, the last straw. What was before we decided to fight the revolution? This was so disruptive in the colonies that the Parliament actually rescinded the Stamp Act after 2 years of attempting to collect it. But the die was cast, and the decision to secede from Great Britain was made. One of the last straws of the life of the Stamp Act was some research done by a group of very bright young students at the College of New Jersey, now called Princeton University, which concluded that it cost more to enforce the Stamp Act than it generated in revenues because of all the soldiers breaking down the doors and writing the search warrants. So it's a head scratcher. One would have to think, why would the government enact a tax that lost money, enact a tax that caused more money to collect than they actually collected, unless the real purpose of the Stamp Act was not to collect money, but to get the government across the threshold and to remind the colonists that they were simply that, colonists, and the king was their master and could do with them as he wished. These are the type of ideas that animated Jefferson and Madison and the others when they did pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honors. Of course, we wrote the Declaration of Independence. We fought a revolution. We wrote the Constitution. The purpose of the Constitution was to assure the colonists that in the new country, the government here would not do to us what the king had done when we were his subjects. In order to do that, each state sent representatives to Philadelphia in 1787 in rough proportion to the population of the state, and they met in secret to write this Constitution. And the very first thing they debated is what we've been talking about and what Tony alluded to and what all of you are familiar with. What is the source of our rights? Is it the government or is it our humanity? There was a big government crowd, believe it or not, in Philadelphia. It was led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. And they argued that because we need the government to protect our rights, because the government has limited resources, the government can decide when to expand our rights and allow us to exercise them freely and when to shrink our rights and decide when we can't exercise them as we wish. That was the big government argument. The small government argument, the anti-federalist argument, the natural law argument, the Jefferson argument, even though Jefferson wasn't there, he was in Paris as the ambassador of the United States to France, but it was made by Madison, was the opposite. And that was, hey, we just signed a Declaration of Independence. And the whole purpose of becoming independent is so that we could exercise our rights freely, because that document says our rights come from God. So this debate, what lawyers call positivism, rights come from the government, what lawyers call the natural law, rights come from our humanity, was the first great debate at Philadelphia. And the answer is a bit of a compromise. The Constitution would be written and it wouldn't mention our rights, but we would guarantee that we would add 10 amendments, which would assure that the new government here would never do to us what the king and the parliament had done to us when we were colonists. And so we're all familiar with the 10 amendments. Many of you probably know some of these lines that I'll now recite. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. First Amendment. I've often argued the most important word in that phrase is the. I'm going to repeat the phrase for you. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Well, why would the framers call it the freedom of speech? Because they recognized its existence. Because they knew it pre-existed the government. It pre-existed us. It comes from the humanity of every individual. To them, the freedom of speech was much as part of human nature as the hands and the fingers on the end of your arm. That's the theory of the Declaration of Independence. That's the thesis underlying the revolution. That's the theory of the First Amendment, which of course doesn't grant rights. It keeps the government from interfering with rights. And so it ticks off the rights that the government can't interfere with. your right to think as you wish and say what you think, your right to develop your personality. I've often told O'Reilly he should be grateful that there's no law against developing your personality. Your right to worship or not to worship. We go to the Second Amendment, your right to keep and bear arms. And let me tell you, that's not about shooting deer. It's about shooting tyrants when they take over the government. The Fourth Amendment, of course, embodies that quintessentially American right, the right to be left alone. Today we call it the right to privacy. You see that threshold? The government in all of its majesty and all of its might cannot pass unless it has a search warrant signed by a neutral judge on the basis of sworn testimony of the likelihood of criminal behavior or evidence of a crime on the other side of the threshold. That's the guarantee of the Fourth Amendment. That is the unique right which the king recognized in England, but he would not recognize here. Okay, George Washington is elected president, John Adams is vice president. They have two very happy, essentially uncontested, controversy-free terms. Then we come to the first presidency, the first term, the only term of John Adams, and there appears throughout the land something that's unthinkable today, fear of the French. The government was afraid that people from France were going to come here and they would vote Adams out and Jefferson in. Jefferson had been the ambassador to France for 10 years, and he was very popular with the French. So they enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically said, look, we have open borders. We're looking for people. We need bodies. We need taxpayers. Come here, you can become a citizen, except if you're French. If you're French, you have to wait 14 years before you can become an American citizen, and maybe then we'll let you vote. Then they added a very terrible, terrible section to the Alien and Sedition Acts, and it said, whoever, French or not, American or not, citizen or not, shall use words that bring the government or the president or the Congress into disrepute is liable to prosecution and incarceration for 2 years in a federal prison. Now you think to yourself, how can the same generation, in some cases the very same human beings that had just written, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, in fact enact a law that abridged the freedom of speech? I'll deviate from the history lesson for a moment. St. Augustine argued that this was caused by libido dominandi. No, not that kind of libido. Libido dominandi is the lust to dominate. It is a defect as a result of original sin that we all have, and we all have to repress it. Some good people get in the government and promise to shrink the government. When they get there, they do their darndest to do it. Most people get in the government and they give in to libido dominandi, and they want to use the power of the government to tell others how to live. And so the big government crowd that was represented by President Adams wanted to tell other people how to live because they thought the government would be smoother, easier, cheaper if it was free from criticism. By the way, in that list, president, Congress, government, who's missing? Who is not immune from criticism? The vice president. It was Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson and Adams, even though Jefferson was the VP and Adams was the president, they didn't speak to each other. Remember in those days how you got elected. Everybody ran for president. Whoever finished first was president. Whoever finished second became vice president. Could you imagine if we did that today or at any time in the modern era? That was changed eventually after the contested election of 1800 in which Jefferson beat Adams. Jefferson, of course, said, if I ever become president, I will not even enforce the Alien and Sedition Acts. But Adams did enforce it. You see, a congressman, a Jeffersonian, a small government anti-federalist congressman named Matthew Lyons from Vermont, decided to test the limits of the Alien and Sedition Acts. President Adams, at times, got a little carried away with himself, and he would put on a purple robe, sometimes with gold epaulets, and he could be seen in public this way. He also had a problem that a lot of middle-aged men have. He had a problem with his waistline. So Congressman Lyons decides in a public place to mock the president by referring to him as his rotundity. And as a result of calling the president fat, he got indicted under the Alien and Sedition Acts for bringing the president and the government into disrepute. And he was tried by a jury of his peers in Boston, and he was convicted, and a federal judge sentenced him to 2 years in a federal prison. Now, if you are from Hudson County, New Jersey, or Boston, or New Orleans or Chicago, you'll understand and appreciate the second half of this story, which is that Congressman Lyons ran for re-election from his jail cell. And he won. By the time he was reelected, Adams was no longer president. Jefferson was in the White House, and he was welcomed back to Washington. One more story of these turning away from the values of the Declaration of Independence, the Revolution, and the Constitution. In Philadelphia in 1787, a person took notes. Now, the notes were kept until the person died. It was James Madison. Madison was the scrivener. Madison effectively wrote the Constitution. His notes were so complete, they took portions of his notes and put them together, and that eventually, after more debate and more crossing out and adding, became the document. Fast forward now to the War of 1812. We get in a dust-up with some British ships in the Mediterranean. The dust-up ends up over here, and the British decide they want to take us back. They burn the White House. They burn the Capitol. Their troops are marching through the countryside. So a platoon of British troops is marching through Upper Marlborough, Maryland, when the troops kidnap 6 townsfolk from this town and threaten to hang them. The militia from the town, in the middle of the night, kidnaps 4 British troops and threatens to hang them. They're at a standoff. So the mayor, John Hodges, without any weapons, without any support, without any bodyguards, without the militia, marches right up to the British encampment, demands to see the British captain, and says, we'll make a trade. We'll give you back your 4 soldiers if you give us back our 6 townspeople. The captain shakes his hand. They make the trade. The troops go back. The townsfolk come home. The War of 1812 is over. We win. The British go home. I mean, Mayor Hodges is an absolute unbelievable hero in this town. They hold a tumultuous parade. And everybody in the town, every office holder, local, state, and federal, is at this parade. At the end of the parade, the mayor is up on a podium, and he gives a speech, and the crowds are wildly enthusiastic for his courage and heroism. He steps down from the podium, and he's met by 2 strangers, one of whom puts shackles on his wrists, and the other hands him a piece of paper. It was an indictment brought by a grand jury in Washington, D.C., and got by the Justice Department for treason, for giving aid and comfort to the enemy in wartime by returning the soldiers. So the mayor is put on trial. The judge at the trial was one of the speakers at the parade. Everybody in the jury was also at the parade. The government stands up and said, well, look, we don't have to present any evidence. Everybody knows what the mayor did. Defense counsel stands up and said, we don't have to present any argument because everybody knows what the mayor did. The judge says to the jury, this is how the times have changed, gentlemen, there were no women on the jury then, gentlemen, go across the street to the local tavern. We've reserved a room for you in the basement. Go in there, drink all you want. When you're ready with a verdict, come back and we'll be waiting for you. Jury foreman raises his hand and says, Your Honor, we already have a verdict. Without any deliberation, we know what the verdict is. It's not guilty. This is the first example in American history of jury nullification. This is 12 farmers telling the almighty federal government, thou shalt not pass. This might be wrong on the books, but it's just as wrong for you to prosecute. Now, there's a dark side to this. This is a happy celebration. It's a published opinion, U.S. versus Hodges. Law students study this in law school. The dark side is the Justice Department has had a rule from day one that no treason prosecution can be had unless it is personally approved by the president. What left-wing creep was the president of the United States in 1812? James Madison, who wrote the Constitution. So you see, something does happen to people. Not everybody is purely Jeffersonian. Not everybody believes that that government is best which governs least and then governs that way. People are handed power, and they sometimes abuse the power, which is why it's very important for people like us who believe that we are entitled to a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution, who really believe that that government is best which governs least, who do believe that because the individual is created in the image and likeness of God And the government is just a temporary organization based on force, that the individual is greater than the state. We all believe that. That's why we're here. That's why elections are so important and they matter. That's why we need to get in the face of public officials and say, why did you do that? Why did you vote for the Patriot Act, Congressman or Congresswoman, when it allows federal agents to write their own search warrants? That's the very reason we fought a revolution 230 years ago to secede from the king and the parliament, because they let their soldiers write their own search warrants, and now you've let federal agents do that to us. Look, these stories go on and on and on. I live on a farm in northwest New Jersey. Right in the middle of the state is New Brunswick. It's the home of Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. A janitor was assigned to clean an office building in New Brunswick, New Jersey, just about 2 years ago. And he knocked on the door. Nobody was there. He opened up the door, and he found what looked to him like very sophisticated surveillance equipment and literature written in Arabic and references to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The guy was terrified. He called his boss, who called his boss, who called the local police. Local police said, my God, we must have something terrible on our hands. So without getting a search warrant, this is about 45 minutes later, the local police go back to this office and they break down the door. And they find inside, operating sophisticated surveillance equipment, 4 New York City cops and 1 CIA agent. Well, now we have a conundrum on our hands. What do the New Brunswick police do? Do they arrest the New York City cops for spying without a warrant and for being cops in New Jersey when they're only authorized to be cops in New York? Do they arrest the CIA agent for plying his trade in the United States of America, even though federal law says CIA agents can only spy outside the United States? Or do the New York cops arrest the New Brunswick cops for breaking down the door without a search warrant? Well, you can imagine the outcome to this. They were all cops. So just as none of them wanted to be a defendant, none of them became a complainant, and everybody went home. This is an example of what happens right under our noses. This is an example of at least 6 federal and state statutes that were violated right under our noses. This didn't even come to light until 2 years later, thanks to a Freedom of Information Act request, which was honored over the objection of the New Brunswick Police, the FBI, and the CIA. So you see, we do have a government which is very, very dangerous. I mean, government is not logic or reason. Government is force. Government is a fire. Government is flames, which have to be kept under control, or it will devour us. My reason for being at Fox is to be a night watchman and watch the government as it steals our liberties and steals our property. My greatest fear is that someday the government will become so big that we can't watch it or criticize it anymore. I am not in fear of the government by standing here and criticizing it. But who knows if I will have that same freedom at some time in the future. I mean, think about what the government has done, and I know that I have to conclude soon. Medicare broke. Medicaid broke. Social Security broke. Amtrak broke. The post office broke. Why? When the federal government took over the Mustang Ranch because it couldn't pay its taxes, they ran that into the ground. So they couldn't provide booze and hookers to truckers in the desert, and they want to provide us with health care. It's a gift from God to love your work, and I love my work. Even though sometimes I have to talk about unpleasant subjects like the loss of liberty. So what do? Well, we confront the government at every turn. Ask your member of Congress if he or she voted for the Patriot Act. Ask them if they even know that it permits federal agents to write their own search warrants. Ask them if they know that it makes it a crime to tell anyone. Your spouse in a bedroom, your lawyer in her or his law office, a judge in a federal courtroom, a priest in confessional, that you received a self-written search warrant. 2 FBI agents walk into a public library in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and one of them has a self-written search warrant under his arm. I know this sounds like a joke. Two guys walk into a bar, and one of them has a duck under his arm. I won't tell you that joke. So the FBI agent, who's 28 years old, serves the search warrant that he has written authorizing himself to get records of who's borrowed books on the head librarian who's a volunteer. She's 86. She says to him, "Who the hell are you?" He says, "I'm an FBI agent, and this is a search warrant." Before he even tells her she can't tell anybody about it, she hands it to her 75-year-old assistant. Fast forward a year, and they are in trial for violating the Patriot Act because they discussed the search warrant with each other. On the eve of the trial, a federal judge says to the U.S. attorney in the courtroom, "I think you should know that tomorrow I'm going to declare the Patriot Act unconstitutional. Do you still want to prosecute these two senior citizens?" Whereupon the U.S. attorney said, "Let me call D.C." D.C. gave them permission to dismiss the indictment. Look at the length and extent that the government will go through, just like George III, not to generate money, but to strike fear in people's hearts. Freedom lies in your hearts, but it must do more than just lie there. Like any muscle, it requires exercise. It must be exercised. You must get in the face of authority and challenge it. On the 15th of October in the year of our Lord 2012, 200 patriots gathered in a hotel room in Tampa, Florida, to talk about human freedom. 50 years, 10 years, 4 years from now, will there be anything left to talk about? That is the challenge that we have. For better or for worse, we are confronted with defending freedom in its maximum hour of danger. Don't shrink from that responsibility. Welcome it. Thank you, my friends, and God bless you.